Hello everyone and welcome back to another Bible study. Today we're in Leviticus chapter 19. We're making some good progress here. We've only got about a week and a half left in Leviticus, which I'm not going to say I'm looking forward to getting out of it. I'm just saying week and a half. When did the events of this chapter take place? Well, the Israelites received these commands from God probably about 1,500 years before Jesus was born, roughly 1490 BC, a year after they left slavery in Egypt. We've got two terms to define in the definition section. The first one is the word stranger or strangers. The Bible uses the word stranger to describe foreigners, basically anybody who wasn't a descendant of one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who wasn't ethnically an Israelite. But these were people who were foreigners who lived amongst the Israelites, both in their camps in the wilderness and then later in Canaan. The second term we have to define is necromancer. If you watch Lord of the Rings, you probably know what this is, but someone who uses magic to conjure the spirits of the dead. I've broken this chapter down into a couple different sections. The first section, verses 1 through 8, God calls the Israelites to holiness. God reminded the people that they were supposed to mimic Him in their behavior and in their lifestyle. Quote, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." Leviticus chapter 19, verse 2. They were to be holy by keeping God's commandments, some of which we've already talked about but are restated in this section. The Hebrews were supposed to respect their parents, keep the Sabbath days, reject idolatry, and offer their peace offerings according to the instructions that God had given them previously. Section number 2, verses 9 through 18, love your neighbor as yourself. God wanted the Israelites to treat their fellow citizens and the strangers who lived amongst them well. And these verses are just a few of God's instructions for how the Israelites were supposed to care for and treat their neighbors. So, for example, while the Israelites were harvesting their fields and their vineyards at the harvest time, they were to leave a small portion of food in the field and not to harvest everything so that needy people could come by and get some food. They were forbidden from lying to each other, stealing, and dealing unethically. They were not allowed to swear by God's name and then not keep the oath, because that would profane the name of God, and obviously it's lying to your brother. Wages that were owed to hired workers were supposed to be paid out as soon as the work was complete. Handicapped people, specifically mentioned here, deaf people and blind people, were not to be mistreated. No Israelite was to try to pervert the course of justice in the judicial system. Finally, they were told not to hate each other in their hearts and not to seek vengeance. Verse 18, quote, "But you shall love your neighbor as yourself." You probably know that verse from the words of Jesus. And now for our last section. I really didn't know what to title this, so I just called it Miscellaneous Laws. Verses 19 through the end of the chapter. You'll see why as we go through this. So God instructed his people that they were not to interbreed two different types of cattle. They were not to sow their field with two different types of crops. They were not to wear clothing that was made out of two different types of material. God gave his rules for what a man needed to do if he was guilty of having a sexual relationship with a slave woman and the sacrifices that he needed to offer to be forgiven. The Israelites weren't to eat fruit from a new tree 3 years after it was planted. On the 4th year, all of its fruit was to be sacrificed to God, and on the 5th year, they were finally allowed to eat from those new fruit trees. Blood was not to be eaten. We've heard that command before. Fortune-telling, omen interpretation, and consultation with mediums and necromancers was forbidden. The Israelites weren't to round off the hair on their temples, and they were not to mar the edges of their beard, cut themselves, or tattoo themselves. A man was not to make his daughter a prostitute or sell her into prostitution. Elders in the community were to be honored and respected. And foreigners, or strangers, who lived amongst the Israelites were supposed to be treated well. Finally, we're told that weights and measurements that are used for buying and selling, weighing money, money changing, things like that, they were to be honest weights and measurements. So there you go. That is chapter 19. Now for our application. A lot of people look at this chapter with all its rules and its restrictions, and they think, you know what, God just likes to put restrictions on human beings and then force them to comply. He's just all about his rules, isn't he? But I would argue that isn't the case. This isn't just God trying to keep us from having fun or doing the things that we want to do. God restricted the Israelites, and he restricts his disciples today because restrictions are essential for identity. And God has always wanted his people to have a unique identity separate from the rest of the world. You cannot have an identity without restrictions on behavior. If you approve of and affirm every behavior and every way of life, you will be an amorphous blob that stands for nothing. In the case of the Israelites, God wanted them to strive for holiness and godliness. What does it mean to be godly? It means to have an identity that's based on God's nature. In our case, we strive for godliness and Christ-likeness, right? To share the identity of Christ, to mirror him. Without restrictions to guide us away from ungodly and unholy behavior, we wouldn't know how to live. We would have no identity. We wouldn't stand for anything. We wouldn't believe in anything. We wouldn't believe in right and wrong. We would just be amorphous blobs. And it's funny in a sense, but at the same time, is it any surprise that as we look out into our modern world, we have so many people in an identity crisis, falling into depression, into hopelessness, and all these vain attempts to find their identity apart from the God who created them?